Welcome to Philosophics, where we explore some of the deepest and most fascinating questions about the nature of reality, the human experience, and the world around us. In this episode, we will be discussing the topic of ethics and morality. We know is a vast and complex one, with many different approaches and perspectives. In this video, we will explore some of the key ideas and debates within this field, and consider their implications for our own lives and society. One of the central questions in ethics is what makes an action right or wrong. Different philosophers have proposed different answers to this question, but some of the most influential theories include consequentialism. According to this view, the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by its consequences. For example, an action that leads to the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people would be considered morally good, while an action that leads to suffering or harm would be considered morally bad. Deontology. According to this view, the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by whether it follows certain moral rules or duties. For example, an action that respects the rights of others or promotes their well-being would be considered morally good, while an action that violates those rights or causes harm would be considered morally bad. Virtue ethics. According to this view, the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by whether it reflects the virtues or good character traits of the person who performs it. For example, an action that shows courage, compassion, or honesty would be considered morally good, while an action that shows cowardice, cruelty, or deceit would be considered morally bad. These theories have their own strengths and weaknesses, and there are many other approaches to ethics that we could discuss. However, for the purposes of this script, we will focus on the implications of these theories for some of the most pressing ethical issues of our time. One such issue is the ethics of war. According to consequentialism, the rightness or wrongness of going to war would depend on whether it leads to the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. This might mean that going to war to prevent a greater evil, such as genocide or terrorism, could be justified, even if it causes suffering and loss of life. However, deontologists would argue that going to war is always wrong, because it violates the moral duty to respect the rights of others and avoid causing harm. They might point out that even in cases where war seems necessary to prevent a greater evil, there are often other ways to achieve the same end that do not involve violence and killing. Virtue ethicists, on the other hand, might focus on the character of the people involved in the decision to go to war. They might argue that going to war requires courage, wisdom, and other virtues, and that leaders who make this decision should be judged on whether they possess these qualities. They might also argue that going to war can be a virtuous act if it is undertaken for the right reasons, such as to defend one's country or to protect the innocent. Another important ethical issue is the environment. Consequentialists might argue that we have a moral obligation to protect the environment, because the consequences of not doing so would be disastrous for humanity and other living beings. They might point to the potential long-term effects of climate change, pollution, and other environmental problems, and argue that we have a duty to prevent these harms even if it involves some sacrifice in the short term. Deontologists, on the other hand, might argue that we have a moral duty to respect the rights of other living beings, and that this includes the right to a healthy and sustainable environment. They might point out that many of our actions, such as burning fossil fuels or destroying habitats, violate these rights, and that we have a moral obligation to stop doing so. Thank you for joining us on the Philosophics. We hope you found this discussion of the ethics of war and the environment to be thought-provoking and enlightening. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comments section below. We look forward to exploring more philosophical topics with you in the future.